So I want to make you aware that we are having a questions and answers session towards the end of the webinar after the presentation. So you'll have an opportunity to post questions in the chat box. So you guys, the attendees are muted, your screens are, your videos are off, but you will have that opportunity to ask questions. So put those in the chat box and we look forward to that, and we'll be addressing those later. I did want to mention that, you know, this particular topic regarding inclusion and accessibility is really important for us at Guide ID. And so we're thrilled to be having this conversation today. I'd like to introduce our panelists. If you can move to the next slide, please. So once again, my name is Jeff Danziger. I'm the sales director for North America for Guide ID. We provide audio guides to museums and historic sites around the world. And our two panelists today, we have Lisa Thompson, who is an exhibit developer at the Natural History Museum of Utah. And we have Pamela Glintenkamp, who is an audio tour producer at Sandpail Productions. So I'd like to welcome them both to this webinar. And by the way, I've just heard a good amount of static. So I don't know if you guys are hearing that, but hopefully I'll get corrected in a moment. But anyway, I'd like to welcome Lisa Thompson from the National History Museum of Utah to get us started. So if you can move on to the next slide, please.
Hello, everybody, and thanks, Jeff and the whole team at Guide ID for inviting Pamela and I to share a bit of our experience with you today. Our plan is to tell you a little bit about some of the key goals that we had, the Natural History Museum had around inclusion and accessibility, and then how we collaborated together to implement them. And we hope that you'll find it useful information, and we're excited to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. I thought it would be helpful to provide you a little bit of context first by introducing our organizations. So the Natural History Museum of Utah is a mid-sized regional natural history museum. In the pre-pandemic days, we welcomed about 300,000 visitors per year on our site. We have 10 permanent galleries as well as a changing special exhibitions gallery. And the museum is an active research institution affiliated with the University of Utah. We have a collection of about 1.6 million objects. It's global in scale, but it's really focused on the Intermountain West. And so the interpretation at the museum highlights the remarkable natural and cultural history of Utah. And then Pamela, could you go ahead and introduce Sandpail and move on to the next slide?
Okay, so Sandpail was established in 1990 and specializes in the creation of audio and video content for museums, historic sites, and other cultural institutions. The first audio tour we produced was in 2003, and that was for the opening of Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. And we had the privilege of interviewing Frank Gehry and Diane Disney Miller, who's the daughter of Walt Disney, about the creation of that new architecture and cultural center for LA. Our other clients include the the National Gallery of Art, the Nevada State Museum, Stratford Hall, which we recently completed an African American tour for, among 3 other themed tours that we've done for that institution, Anish Kapoor's Orbit in the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in London, and the Berkshire Botanical Garden in Massachusetts. We emphasize high production values and kind of a customized approach for each project in response to the client's needs. So hopefully Lisa and I will be able to outline for you what those needs were for the museum and how Sandpail was able to respond to those needs. Next slide, please.
Okay, I hope my audio is going to be okay. So this audio guide was the first audio guide that the Natural History Museum of Utah has ever produced. And it arose out of a desire to provide more accessibility for international visitors and hopefully entice more bus trips to visit the museum. The scope of the project was to create an English tour and then translate that into French, German, Korean, Japanese, Mandarin, and Spanish, and to create a descriptive tour for low vision visitors as well. And because it was our first tour, we're really glad to be able to collaborate with Sandpail Productions and Guide ID on the project. But within that basic scope, we began to think about, well, what could we do to look at ways to make this tour accessible and inclusive across different dimensions, in addition to simply the languages that were being featured. And so one important goal for the museum was to highlight as many voices as we could of different experts within the museum and within our community to create a variety of points of access that would appeal to audiences with diverse interests. And I like this idea. I think of it as we're showcasing the museum as a community as well, not just simply a single voice of the museum. And doing this required engaging experts in the content creation and conducting 22 different interviews during the COVID pandemic before we had the vaccine. Before we tell you a little bit about how we did that, I wanted to be able to play a trailer for you that will give you a sense of the diverse voices that were in the tour. So if we could go to the next slide. And this was Pamela's brilliant idea to have this trailer, and it's featured on our website now. So if you could go ahead and play it for us.
There's a story behind every exhibit at the Natural History Museum of Utah. Stories of new discoveries, ancient knowledge, one-of-a-kind objects, and much more. With the Insider Stories audio guide, you'll hear these fascinating stories directly from museum scientists, Indigenous culture keepers, and some special guests. You'll also hear from me, Jason Cryan, the museum's executive director, as together we explore 29 exhibits throughout the museum and get the inside scoop from the experts.
Ceratopsian dinosaurs have a very cool evolutionary story.
This is one of the rarest minerals in the world.
This robe kept someone warm over 3,000 years ago.
A fossil skeleton that is absolutely unique.
They look like cotton balls sitting on top of stilts.
We call it kamumuroi. That means rabbit blanket.
They can live on a diet of seeds that are perfectly bone dry.
It's called the humongous fungus.
They would have been very soft and warm to wear. I wish I had a pair.
Just ask for the Insider Stories audio guide at the welcome desk when you arrive at the museum. Use one of our audio devices or your own smartphone. I look forward to seeing you at the museum soon.
Thanks. Before we move on to the next slide, I also just wanted to point out to you the marker, that the circle with the silver outline. This is our marker for all the stops throughout the museum, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. It's also important to note that you can't see it in this photo, but it's actually raised off the glass by about a ½ inch or so because it's covering an identifier beacon, which is what folks use to trigger the audio on their podcatcher player. And just keep that in mind because we'll come back to it later. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So as I mentioned, working to bring this vision to fruition of having a community of voices within the audio guide, we went through a process of consulting with 22 different experts and interviewing them to create the tour. And what this meant was kind of walking the galleries with a variety of scientists and collection managers from the museum, writing up draft stories of what they wanted to talk about, and then creating questions based on those stories, all before we started the interviews. And we wanted the interviews to have a very conversational feel, but they needed to have guardrails around them too, or some guidance about what kind of the stories that we were going to feature. And so after we'd done all this kind of pre-work on the stories, we needed to create a place where we could actually conduct the interviews during the pandemic. And we came up with a solution that worked really well. We created a recording studio on site, and that's what you're looking at in this image. The chair that's closest to you is where the interviewee sat. They had 2 iPads in front of them. One had photos of the exhibit that they were talking about. The other was a Zoom call with Pamela, I, and the audio producer who was sitting in the room across the way. And then I sat in the third little glass room so I could help with any issues that came up. This type of solution, hopefully there won't be a situation where there's a pandemic again, but maybe this type of solution could work well for your site. What it allowed us to do was to have all the interviews conducted at the museum rather than or most of the interviews conducted at the museum rather than having to go out to a recording studio. Next slide, please.
So we were able to find a local sound engineer who has his own radio program in Salt Lake City, and he was the very skilled individual who did the recordings in the studio Lisa was just telling you about, and also took a location trip, which you'll hear about in a little bit. But in terms of scheduling all of the experts who are, for the most part, based at the museum, you can see in this image that the scheduling was quite complicated because we're bringing the audio engineer in for a block of time. We don't want him to come in for one interview, then go away, then come back and set up again. So we created blocks of working time where, as you can see, different experts would talk about different audio tour stops, the content that Lisa and the experts had decided upon. And we had prepared the interview questions in advance so that they knew what they would be discussing with us. One thing I wanted to mention, Lisa talked about in the studio, having the Zoom connection with Lisa and myself. That actually helps greatly in terms of making the response that you're recording very conversational, because as Lisa said, we were hoping to have a conversational tone to the stories and information that these individuals were sharing with us. And I was very grateful to also work with Casey Clifford on Lisa's team to try to coordinate the schedule for all of these different individuals at the museum. Next slide, please.
So I wanted then to tell you the story of a particular place where we wanted to showcase voices from the community, and that was in our Native Voices exhibit. The exhibit features the cultures, the indigenous cultures of Utah, both their history and contemporary culture. And this gallery at the museum was created in consultation with the tribal liaisons from Utah. And the museum is really fortunate that we've had an Indian Advisory Committee guiding the content that we produce about Indigenous communities since the 1980s. And one of the things that they tell us over and over again is really important to them is that the museum feature stories of contemporary Indigenous people, that we try to combat the stereotype that Indigenous people exist only in the past. And so both the members of the Indian Advisory Committee and the museum staff were excited that the audio guide provided a really wonderful opportunity to highlight those contemporary voices. And we really wanted to make sure then that the content in this gallery was driven by the members of the Indian Advisory Committee. Next slide, please. So for a little bit of context, this map shows Utah in the center with the traditional ancestral homelands of the 5 cultural groups that call Utah home: the Paiute, the Goshute, Shoshone, Ute, and Navajo. And within those 5 cultural groups, there are 8 federally recognized tribes in Utah, and 6 of those tribes participate actively on the museum's Indian Advisory Committee. So our process was to reach out to those tribal liaisons and begin a discussion about what object they wanted to feature within the audio tour. And so I would set up meetings and took lots and lots of photos of the exhibit. We would review them. Sometimes the liaisons would want to talk to tribal elders or tribal councils before they came to a decision on what object to feature. And then we also asked them to tell us who should speak about this object. So it wasn't, a museum curator, it was someone from their community. And they put me in touch with that person then, and then we arranged to set up an interview. We felt it was really important to pay those people for their time and expertise, just as you would pay any expert for sharing their knowledge with you. And so we also set up a system to be able to do that. And Pamela's going to tell you a little bit more about then how we arranged the interviews. Next slide, please.
So we were able to tap into a tremendous resource in local radio stations. So at a local radio station, most of which were public radio stations, you have a sound-safe room, you have professional audio equipment, and you have a professional audio engineer. So for the Indigenous voices that had been identified by the advisory group and Lisa, for the most part, we found a radio studio that was nearby to them and convenient for them to get to. We then had a Zoom connection, Lisa and myself, to the studio, and were able to have the conversation with the individual. In one case, we weren't able to find a radio studio, but we did find an audio engineer who had a home studio that was quite near to the Navajo pictorial weaver we were interviewing. So it's always important, of course, to accommodate not only the interviewee's availability, but to make the experience convenient for them. And this we felt was particularly important. And then, of course, in the time of the pandemic, we didn't want to ask people to travel very far from where they were based. Next slide, please.
And as Pamela mentioned, there was one instance when we went to the person's home. There was a Goshute elder. Her name is Orlena McCurdy. You'll get to hear a little bit of her interview in a moment. She was 87, I believe, at the time, and possibly one of the last cradle makers in the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute. And it just really wasn't possible for her to travel to a radio station. So the sound engineer, Roger, and I went to her and recorded an interview on her front porch. Next slide, please. So to make this content as inclusive as possible, we wanted to give both the interviewees and our tribal liaisons opportunities to review and approve all of the content. So we provided rough cuts of each audio stop to them and built time then into the schedule for that review process to happen. And then we also wanted to make sure that we were sharing the assets that we had jointly created together. And so the museum provided copies of both the full interviews, which were often over an hour, and the edited audio guide stop to both the tribal liaisons for a tribal archive if they had one, and to the interviewees to make use of in ways that they could foresee in the future. And Pamela, do you want to talk a little bit more about the scheduling part of this?
Yes, I think that for the scheduling, we needed to be aware in advance, and Lisa had kind of warned us that we would have to allow a good amount of time to allow for the review of these materials, because the inclusion of these individuals isn't just at the beginning, it's throughout the entire process. So we needed to be aware in our overall production schedule of what the turnaround time was going to be for the number of people that needed to review the materials. One thing about the clip Lisa's going to play for you, which demonstrates the UN dubbing process and how we preserved that interview content for the alternate languages, is first you'll hear the French narrator, so you have to listen through a bit of that, but then you'll hear two different of the Indigenous interviewees, their statements. One of them is Orlena McCurdy, who Lisa mentioned earlier, but you'll hear that we have over that the French voice providing the interpretation. So it's a way for us to, in the alternate language versions, preserve that interview content, which we felt was extremely important. In the alternate language versions, for both cost and scheduling reasons, we didn't preserve all of the other interview content. We replaced that with the alternate language narration. But for the Native Voices section of the tour, we decided to do the UN dubbing, which you'll hear a little bit of in this clip. So if we can play the clip, please.
Orlena McCurdy a fabriqué le berceau que vous pouvez voir au numéro 7 de cette vitrine. Par une chaude après-midi d'été, Orlena et sa fille, Delia Moon, sont assises sous leur porche, à Ibapa, dans les tribus confédérées de la réserve des Goshute. Elles expliquent comment Orlena fabrique des berceaux et comment leur famille les utilisait. Pendant qu'elle parle, Orlena tient sur ses genoux un berceau presque terminé qu'elle a fabriqué pour un nouveau bébé de la communauté.
My name is Delia Moon.
Je m'appelle Delia Moon et voici ma mère Orlena McCurdy.
My mom is about the only one that's
Ma mère est à peu près la seule à en fabriquer aujourd'hui. Tous les anciens qui confectionnaient ces objets sont déjà partis. Et pour autant que je sache, ma mère est la seule.
My name is Orlena McCurdy.
Je m'appelle Orlena McCurdy. Je suis née ici à Ibapa en 1934. J'ai grandi ici et je suis toujours là.
Tout cet objet est fabriqué à partir de saules qu'elle coupe dans les montagnes. Elle dit que le meilleur moment pour les cueillir, c'est au début du printemps.
So one thing just about that clip, you hear also that the native voices fade in and out. They come back in between the gaps. So that presence stays there throughout. Next slide, please.
All right. So the museum saw an audio guide as a way to significantly improve accessibility at the museum for the low vision community through the Descriptive Tour. We knew that from the outset. And so our goal was to, use the audio guide to create a really rich experience for the low vision community and to make it as close as possible as we could to the experience that we had created for sighted visitors on the general audience tour. But as we got into producing the tour, I had a dawning realization that creating the descriptive tour was only solving one part of a problem, that there was a bigger problem, which was how would low vision visitors navigate the tour in the museum's complex spaces. And so you can see on this map that there are 29 stops. They're on 4 different levels in the museum. There's a north half and a south side of the museum, and there are stops on both sides. And we were worried about whether sighted visitors would be able to navigate the tour. And so we'll have Pamela tell you a little bit about how we created the descriptive tour, and then talk a little bit more about the solution we came up with for helping low vision visitors navigate the museum. Let's go to the next slide.
So if you imagine we had completed the general tour, and what we needed to do was to take that general tour script and make it appropriate for a low vision audience. And that meant that we preserved certain parts of the narration. We needed to then add some descriptive content to make up for the low vision situation for the visitor. And then we wanted to preserve as much as possible the interview content with the experts. So we engaged a very talented woman called Mariam Tabui, and she had written a low vision tour series and devised a training program for the docents at Craft Contemporary in Los Angeles. And I worked with her to take that script from the general tour and to develop the descriptions and insert those and decide what bits of content we needed to sacrifice, because of course to put that descriptive content in, we need to make space so we don't create an audio tour stop that's twice as long for the low vision visitors. And as you'll hear in this audio clip, the first short paragraph is narration that comes from the general tour. Then there's the description, which I think is quite evocative in terms of creating the image of what the visitor would be able to see. And then we have the interview content. And the criteria we use for what interview content we would preserve would be when someone is talking about something that doesn't really require you to see the details, we preserve that. And then we added the description where necessary to support that content. So if we can just play the audio clip, and I'll let you know when we've heard the part we need to hear.
Today, finding one archaeological site in North America that hasn't been vandalized is rare. In 2002, archaeologists stepped through the gate of a private ranch in Range Creek Canyon and found hundreds. In this display, a wall mural of Range Creek shows rising reddish-brown cliffs dotted with dark green shrubs. The color of the cliffs stands out from the bright blue sky spotted with fluffy white clouds. The foreground recalls the smell of hot earth and grass with low shrubs and rocky red soil.
Hi, I'm Shannon Boomgarden. I'm an archaeologist here at the Natural History Museum, and I'm director of the Range Creek Field Station. So Range Creek Canyon is a really special site because it houses over 500 archaeological sites, most of those dating to...
So as you heard, there was some general narration, there was the description, and then we started to hear the interviewee's content. Next slide, please.
Right, so we had this amazing descriptive tour in the works, but we're worried about how people would navigate. So we called on some experts to come help us. We worked in the past with a gentleman named Everett Bacon, who is the president of the Utah chapter of the National Federation for the Blind. And we had a soft launch of the general tour running and invited him to come up and test it out. And there were several things that he really liked about it. He loved that the podcatcher was really easy for him to use. As soon as he was in the proximity of one of the markers, it was very easy to activate the tour on the podcatcher. And he also really liked the design of those markers that we saw earlier back on the case with the Allosaurus fossils in it, because he said he often runs his hand along a wall when he's in a new space, and that the shape and the raised texture of the marker would be very easy for him to identify. And then he thought that the content was wonderful too. And then he had an idea for us, a suggestion of how we could help visitors navigate the museum. And it was through an app that's called Aira, and you can see it here. It's spelled A-I-R-A. And what Aira does is it connects a person to a specially trained agent. And the agent is able to look out through the camera lens of a person's smartphone and see what they are seeing, and then help a person do any number of tasks, including navigate a space in a museum. And so we were really eager to see if this solution would work for the museum. So we worked with Aira to schedule a demo at the museum and invited members, of the low vision community, as well as other representatives of the University of Utah from our Office of Equal Opportunity, the Student Disability Access Center, the Moran Eye Center, which works with people who are losing their vision. And the participants all agreed it was a really incredible success. One of the low vision participants who had been to the museum before said that he had never, felt so free and so, independent within the museum. And that was something we heard from Everett was, many of your low vision and blind visitors will come in a social group because that's how people often visit museums. But, for people who want to come on their own, we felt it was really important that we make this experience accessible for them to do independently. And so the museum is now the first Aira free spot on the University of Utah campus. Hopefully we will be one of many. People can either subscribe to Aira as a service, and then they can access it wherever they go. But if that's not accessible for people, if it's not affordable for people, if they come to the museum, the service is free, and we can help them quickly download the app onto their smartphone and get started. So I think next slide, please. So I just wanted to wrap up with a few final thoughts before we get into questions. As any of you have done work in inclusion before, you know that it's the relationships that's key to making this work happen. And we were really lucky that we had strong relationships with our Indian Advisory Committee and with folks at the Utah chapter of the National Federation of the Blind to help us work through some of the challenges that we faced in making the tour more inclusive. And then nurturing those relationships means that the work goes beyond the launch of the tour. For example, in talking with our tribal nation liaisons about the audio guide, there were questions and ideas they had that come up about things they would like to see change within the exhibit. So we'll be following up on that work with them as well. And I'm sure as we go on, working with the low vision community, that we're going to find additional ways that we could enhance both the audio guide experience and the general experience for our low vision visitors. But there's also been some really immediate, tangible benefits. For example, the Moran Eye Center is super excited to bring some of their older people who are losing their vision to the museum to learn IRA at the museum, and then hopefully also really enjoy their museum experience. Folks from the museum have been invited to present at the conference for the Utah chapter of the National Federation for the Blind. So these relationships continue to build. And then just to let you know where we are, a couple initial visitor reactions. We've had a soft launch running for a while and a survey that goes with that. Much of the questions in the survey were kind of more functional, like, can you get the podcatcher to work? Did the volume work for you? Those kinds of things. But people also had an opportunity to share comments, and you know, people overwhelmingly loved the opportunity to hear from the wide range of voices in the guide, and also really connected with the Indigenous speakers. And there was one person I had a chance to talk to more in depth, and she was a museum member who really was a bit skeptical about the audio guide. She'd been to the museum a lot. She was pretty confident that she knew all the stories at the museum and didn't think that the audio guide would really enhance her experience. But she was blown away and said that the audio guide, revealed, just a whole trove of stories that she hadn't heard before, and that she really appreciated the opportunity to connect with so many different scientists and experts during the tour. And we are just now beginning a more official launch of the audio guide. The PR launch is this week. We wanted to wait until we had the low vision and the Spanish, as well as the general English tours ready to go. And then we'll continue to roll out Japanese, French, Korean, Mandarin, and German in the coming months. So with that, we'd love to take some questions.
So before we start the Q&A, Lisa and Pamela, thank you so much. I mean, that's such great information. What you're doing there is just so fabulous. And I love listening to those audio clips. I mean, the audio is just tremendous, and I love the voices. So I think you've done just a wonderful job. So my colleague Marlisa Buter is going to go through. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat box, so she's going to go through those and throw those out to you guys. And we look forward to hearing your responses. So Marlisa, you can take the floor.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Lisa and Pamela. I will start from the top, so I'll work my way down. So Michelle asked, she would love to know if there are any metrics for how many people actually accessed the audio guide trailer on the website.
I'm sorry, I don't have that information at that time because we're just starting the PR launch, but that's something we could definitely track, and because we have Google Analytics on the site. But I think just because we're just getting started, we haven't measured it yet.
Then I've got a question from Sarah. She's curious to know what percentage of your visitors use this resource. Also, what feedback have you gotten so far? That's the first part of the question. This is the second part as well.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, we're just officially rolling it out. I would say during the member launch, when we were promoting it to members, we had 100 people or so come during the pandemic and test it out for us. So I think that was a good response and a good indication that people, now that we're really promoting it, and that will be eager to take it up.
Then the second part of the question was, throughout your journey, what is the one learning curve mistake that you made, if any, for museums that are looking to do this similar thing in the future? What is something you didn't know at the beginning of the project?
Yes, for me, it was a huge learning curve throughout the whole experience. I think one of the things that I mentioned was figuring out the realization that creating a descriptive tour wasn't going to be sufficient if people couldn't actually navigate with that tour. I think also we did a really good job with the timing and the scheduling. That part of the project was much more complex than I anticipated, and was really grateful that Pamela, who had experience in this realm, was able to be there to guide it for us. Pamela, were there other things that you would mention?
No, I just wanted to say that the majority of clients that we work with, like Lisa and the Natural History Museum, have not produced audio tours before. We often go on to produce several audio tours for a client. Like I mentioned, Stratford Hall, we've produced 4 tours for them, all of which are delivered with the podcatcher. But I always say we're here to answer questions, to hold your hand. No question is too simple or basic. So I think hopefully the fact that we've been doing this for quite some time and that there's a broad range of different types of tours that we produce, anything that comes up is probably something that we've come across before and have a number of solutions the client can choose from. So hopefully that made Lisa's journey a little easier. But just to say that, as I mentioned, the majority of our clients have never produced an audio tour before when they work with us.
Then I've got a question from Emily. It's about budgeting. So she's asking, how do you weigh the budget impact of a project of the size of this when it may become outdated in the future?
Yes, certainly there will be times when we're going to need to update the tour, and that was something that I think is a little bit of a challenge with the format we decided, in that if people retire or leave the museum over time, we may need to re-record those segments. And so that's definitely something that might make our tour less durable over time than simply having one narrator who you could go back to quickly and re-record a stop. I think for us, we were fortunate in that we were able to write a grant that covered the cost of the tour. We're making the tour available at a very low cost for visitors. It's just $2. For members, it's free. For people who qualify for the Museums for All program, it's also free. And then we'll build it into tour packages for international visitors. And I think that was, I guess, the goal was to have something to offer these international visitors, increase that part of our business, but to offer, to not make it a revenue generation as much of a priority for the general visitors, to make this something that would be, that cost would not be a barrier, that what the price we're charging is basically just to allow us kind of to cover the ongoing operating cost of the program.
Great. And then I also have a couple questions about area. So first of all, Zicket remarks saying it's a very good, cool program. They're using it as Smithsonian as well. Then there's also a question from Michelle, how would one access the descriptive tours? Did the different audio stops have different numbers than the general tour? How did you make the difference between the two?
Great question. So when people begin the tour and get a podcatcher, which is their listening device, they activate the tour that they want to hear by first pointing at a kind of like a starter beacon or an initiation beacon. And so I can choose whatever language I want or the low vision tour. And then it's set to the descriptive tour once you click on that beacon. And so you can use the same set of markers, identifiers throughout the museum and listen to whichever tour you want, depending on how you've set your podcatcher at the outset of the tour.
Then there was also an operational question. Was it for the visitors a learning curve to get them to go to the area and visit that site, particular site?
So during our soft launch, people seemed to take to it pretty intuitively. We gave them a little bit of demonstration on how to use the podcatcher. We had the introduction site right there so that they could try it out, and there was a visitor services staff there to answer any questions. We gave them a map and sent them on their way. Most people were able to navigate the tour quite successfully. Sometimes they had the volume buttons. They realized they had to push the volume button more than they thought to get the volume to where they wanted it to be. But it seems to be really intuitive for folks, and they took right to it.
Was there any international cost or cost model for area?
What we've heard from our sales representative is that the cost, they have a kind of flat rate for an institution like a museum to become a IRA-free spot, and that's $5,000 a year. And I don't know, we're a much smaller museum than the Smithsonian, so I don't know, how that would translate over organizations of different sizes. But we have initiated the service for a year and we'll track our metrics and are working hard right now to get the word out within the low vision and blind community that this is available.
And then are there any other options? For instance, if a visitor is not equipped with a smartphone or is not able to download the app onto their phone?
Yeah, we have a series of iPads that we can make available to people so that they can use those. And we're talking about also getting some smartphones that we could make available for people to check out.
Okay, great. Yeah, that was one of the questions people were wondering, how other people would access. Then I also have, do you source or help identify speakers, or are the museums responsible for sourcing the speakers and providing all the stories and content?
Yeah, I guess that's a question for me.
Yeah.
Usually the museum sources voices in terms of interviewees. Occasionally, the museum will want to provide the narrator. In this case, the museum chose to have Jason Cryan, the museum's executive director, be the narrator. We, for most of the time, provide all of the professional voices based on conversations with the client and what their needs are and what their hopes are for the character of that voice. We do also work with the client to discuss what the best sorts of interviewees would be if you want to include that sort of content. So while we might not be suggesting who you should interview, we talk in a general way about the sorts of content that would be appropriate for the tour that's being produced. And then once those interviewees are selected, we work with the client to develop interview questions that are going to be efficient and also targeted to what we want to cover in each audio tour stop.
And then Agnes, also question from him was, how was the overall production timeline from the start all the way up to production, reviews, and the soft launch of the tour?
Well, I think, Lisa, we started in March, so almost a year ago, but we finished the general tour and the low vision tour and the Spanish tour quite a number of months ago. So I would say maybe 7 months, and that's also operating at the height of the pandemic, to create what is 90 minutes of cumulative content, much more than most audio tours we produce in terms of the amount of content we're producing. 22 interviews, all of the location interviews you heard about, the low vision tour, and then the Spanish tour. We've already now, almost at the 1 year mark, also finished the French tour, the German tour, and the Japanese tour are in production right now. But it was, that kind of has gone into a bit of slow motion only because from the museum's perspective, there wasn't that much of a rush to complete the other language tours because of the more limited tourism that's happening right now in the location.
Then one of the other question was also, are there any other perspectives moving forward? So not just adding multiple languages, but any other ideas around the tour?
At this point, I think we're eager to launch it out into the community and see what kind of response we get. We decided to launch the Spanish tour along with the English and the descriptive tour because the museum is working on building relationships within the Spanish-speaking community in Salt Lake County, where the museum is located. And so one thing that I'd be eager to do is to work with the Spanish-speaking community on how we can make this tour more accessible, and maybe in the future look at additional content that would kind of reflect community perspectives about the museum from the Spanish-speaking community.
And then there's also a question from before the whole project. So the pre-production process, before you interviewed any participants, how did you come to decide on the stories you're going to tell and what they would be told? Did that process work okay? Worked that good for you?
Yeah, so it was a collaboration, I would say, between ideas that I had, working with the different experts to suss out stories that they wanted to tell, and also using the resources that we had developed in the past. We'd had an in-person highlights tour. We had actually a cell phone tour that accessed a mobile website. So we had some feedback from visitors on things we knew that they were particularly interested in as well from these previous tour iterations. And so that kind of functioned almost like a front-end evaluation to help us identify things that we knew visitors were particularly interested in, and then combine that with kind of what we knew were the juicy stories behind some of the objects that weren't included in the current interpretation, where we could, really tell stories that dug a little deeper and that revealed some of these aspects of Utah's incredible natural and cultural history that weren't currently being told in the museum. So it was kind of an iterative process then between using the material and the information we already had from previous tours, and then ideas that the scientists and I had about how we could then kind of move that forward into stories that weren't being told yet.
Then there's another operational question about, because we mentioned in the presentation that people could find, a visitor could find a raised marker, the raised identifier on the glass, but if there's any way how you incorporate that with other artworks, so potentially mounted on the wall.
So we have a variety of touch specimens in the museum and that people can feel, but as far as we don't have, I guess, a ton of other artwork. It's more specimen based behind glass often. So
that's the most common. Yeah, absolutely. And then there were a few more questions indeed about the low vision tour. There's Jennifer asking if there was any incorporation with Braille on the beacons or markers or any of the wayfinding maps.
I think Braille, is that?
Braille,
BR, yeah, okay, Braille. Yeah, got it. So at this point, we haven't used Braille, and that was on the advice of Everett Bacon, who it was our liaison from the National Federation of the Blind. It would be something that we'd be open to pursuing in the future if the community identifies that as a need. The information we had from Everett was that the number of people who read Braille is actually relatively small, and that that we ought to be looking for solutions that work for people who didn't read Braille, and that would be a larger part of the community.
Thank you. There are a few more questions on there, but I'm just noticing we're ending our time for the webinar. So I'm just checking with Jeff if we want to continue or if we're just going to wrap up and send out a combined message to people answering the rest of the questions. Thank you so much, Lisa and Pamela.
Thank you, Marlisa, for facilitating that Q&A. We do have a couple more minutes. So, but I guess we do want to wrap up. Before we wrap up, I did want to, I actually had a couple quick questions for you. One of them, I think I'd like to talk, it would be good for the audience to know about. You're distributing our podcatchers, and I noticed some of the questions were about, you know, are there numbers involved or not? And I think it's good to make clear to the audience that those of them that have not seen our device in action is there are no numbers involved with a podcatcher. You point at a trigger and it plays automatically. So generally there's just some type of audio symbol that a visitor would point at. So I wanted to kind of at least, you know, make the audience aware of that. Also, as we talked about, you've also deployed a mobile website. One of the things that we've seen really worldwide with our clients is that when visitors are given a choice between hardware and a mobile solution, 95% of them are taking the hardware. And I wanted to confirm that with you, Lisa. I believe that's what we're seeing from your side as well. Could you give us a little insight onto that?
That's correct. So far, people have been choosing the podcatchers overwhelmingly over their own mobile devices, but we like having the mobile device as a backup because we only have 50 podcatchers right now, and we're hopeful that the tour will be very popular. And then having the mobile website on smartphone gives you know, an additional way that people can experience the tour.
Yeah, and we actually do see that a lot. It's a great extra solution for when you run out of equipment. People can then use it on their phone. So it's a really good backup plan, which brings me to my last question before we kind of end the podcatches, the webinar, excuse me, is regarding school groups and big group tours. Do you anticipate using the audio guide for that, or is that simply a guided experience?
Yeah, we definitely plan on using it for like bus tours, especially of international visitors. But we've also already had, you know, folks from within the United States requesting a tour and have actually deployed the audio guide a couple of times already for them. So our field trip program is really designed specifically for school kids. The tour is more gauged at adults, but we definitely foresee using the audio guide as a tool to enhance the experience of large groups, both domestic and international.
Great. Well, that's great to know. I want to thank you both, Lisa and Pamela, for participating in this. I think it's a fabulous topic. I think we see by the questions there's a lot of interest here, and we will be sharing this webinar with our viewers. And I do apologize for any technical glitches that we had during this, but I think we got through it okay, and I think we all learned a lot about this. So once again, thank you so much for joining. On this slide, you can see my information. If anyone wants more information, I could absolutely put them in touch with with Lisa or Pamela for further questions. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you for joining.